Okay.
All right. Welcome to BookCAST, where we love books and we love talking about books. I'm Dana, and this is my dad, Keith.
Hello.
And welcome to episode 13. We are starting a new book.
Unlucky 13? Hope not.
Unlucky so far. Oh my goodness. We are starting Tolkien's Book of Lost Tales 1.
The extraordinary history of Middle Earth. Edited by his son, Christopher Tolkien. And I want to lay out a couple of disclaimers before we get started. We
Yeah,
do
like
this,
a whole list of
yes,
disclaimers.
we do this just for the fun of it. We do not claim to be Tolkien experts. We're here just to have a good time. So we ask for everyone not to be critical. We are simply going to be presenting our opinion and our interpretation of what we read in chapter one tonight. We do not claim to be trying to teach this stuff. This is just for the fun of reading.
Yeah, we're just
Dana?
trying to have fun.
Exactly. Yep.
So,
Chapter one.
um, well, the actual chapter itself was pretty short because it's mostly notes, notes and poems.
Yeah.
Um, we meet Errol. Is that how you say his name? Errol or Ariel?
Let me see. I got to go look it up. Hold on a second. I guess we're not discussing the forward.
We can.
Where his name is. Ariel? No. Errol. Eriol. I would say
I would
Errol.
say Errol.
I would say
It's
Errol
just
too.
when I hear Errol, I think of Errol the owl from Harry Potter. So.
I think I'm one of my cousins. Always have.
But well, we could start with the forward, where Christopher Tolkien explains the whole reason, like, well, he explains the whole book itself, right?
Yeah, sort of. What I got out of it was the fact that he goes through and he tries to explain how difficult it was to read all of his dad's notes and try to make sense of them. Because, I mean, he really made it sound like it was just chaotic, written on pieces of paper. Some of it was half erased. They had to guess at a lot of it. They had to kind of combine things between the notes his dad had, letters that he sent Christopher himself, things that his mom wrote. It gave me a headache to read the forward. It was just, but he says that what they basically did was himself and some professor, I think it was, they just tried to organize these things so that we could see how his dad, from an early stage back in like 1916, 1915, began working on the history and the world that would be Middle Earth. And somewhere along the way, he decided to, I just went blank. Somewhere along the way, um, he eventually built enough of a history. The piece that I don't remember, and maybe you remember this part, Dana, is where along that way did he get to the point where he was grading the school papers and wrote down in a hole in the ground lived a hobbit? Because from what I can understand, a lot of this stuff that he started writing about this was before he came up with the Hobbit.
Yeah, that's what I understood as well. Like he
Right.
wrote a lot of this way before he even thought about The Hobbit. He
Yeah.
wrote about because he was writing about gnomes and elves, but not gnomes as we would think of them, which is why he threw out that word altogether. The gnomes were really the Noldor, and it just all. But all of this, So that's why I was a little confused because I always thought he had written The Hobbit first. But
Yeah, and
reading this,
apparently he
I
didn't.
realized, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's like he was trying to create a mythology for England to have because England didn't really have a mythology. They had a little bit of stuff with the King Arthur things, but he didn't really look at that as really like a mythology. That was just a story. This, he was genuinely trying to create a mythology for England so that they would have some type of mythology for them. So a lot of the letters that he wrote talking about some of the places that we're going to hear about in the Book of Lost Tales and the rest of the histories of Middle Earth are letters he wrote to like Warwick, which is a city that I think he lived in at one point, to England itself. They were letters kind of introducing this fairy tale that he was trying to construct into a mythology. So he was literally trying to create a history that really didn't exist.
Kind of
And
like how the Greeks and Romans have their mythologies, and he
right,
admired that about the Greeks and the Romans.
yeah. And I think based on other things that I've also read some Tolkien biographies. So I have a history from reading those on some of the things he did. The cat just went crazy. Some of the things that he did in creating and writing a lot of these stories and letters. A lot of these are from letters he wrote to his kids, letters he wrote to friends, his wife, just open letters to the city that he lived in and that type of stuff. And it's like he would create these places and he would tie these places together with certain individuals, and eventually he wrote so much of it that and he had all of these notes that he started blending some of it into the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. He used what he already had to help further develop some of those stories. And I think
Hmm.
what Christopher Tolkien tries to do is tries his best to show how it all ties in together. And I have no idea how crazy this man is, or he's still around. He just recently retired, but he's still around. I have no idea how crazy he really was to even try to take this on. Because
Yeah,
how do
because it
you sit
sounded like
there?
it.
Even this might not be accurate. I mean, it's as accurate as anyone else would do it. But I mean,
Because
Christopher Tolkien is simply trying to guess what his dad was thinking. I mean,
and
that's
even then,
crazy.
it's Christopher Tolkien's interpretation, from based on what he found.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's probably as accurate as anyone else's could be because he's got the actual source documents that
Yeah,
he
he's got
based
to
all of
know.
this from. You know, you just locked up.
And you see, I'm still going. I'm still fine over here.
Yeah, it's locking up. Apologies, everyone. You're probably going to see some sporadic locking up of. I apparently have been having internet problems all day and still having some. I'm hoping we won't have to stop it, and we can get through the first chapter. We're probably going to take these one chapter at a time, by the way.
Yeah, it's very um thick reading material. As in there's a lot that you can talk about in just one chapter.
Hmm. A whole lot. Um, so basically, I mean, in I know we didn't write any notes on the forward itself, but definitely put together a very long time ago. Um,
1916, 1917, maybe.
he talks about some of the pieces of being able to, yeah, the Cimmerillion. I wanted to talk about that briefly because he did talk in the forward about the Cimmerillion and how basically J.R.R. Tolkien had pretty much completed the Cimmerillion for the most part. But he specifically chose not to publish it in the early 60s when he had finished it. I think it was around 62 or 63. He chose not to publish it because in his mind, what made now this is Tolkien's mind, what made The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings interesting was the fact that they took place in a moment in time in the history of Middle Earth where there is a history that comes before all of that. And to Tolkien, that made the reading even more interesting because you got a lot more story and a lot more potential for your mind to expand, thinking about, well, what happened long ago? Who were Bilbo's ancestors and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So Tolkien really believed that that made the story interesting. So he chose not to publish the Silmarillion because it originally started out as the story of men and how men became, or how men started out. Changed it and kind of turned it around. I don't know if he did that or Christopher did that and made it about the history of elves. I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien might have done it. I really don't remember that part. Maybe you do. But it ended up becoming the history of elves and how the elves began. So
I
there
think it
is
was
no history
Christopher
for that.
Tolkien. I
So
think
there,
it was Christopher that did
it may
it.
be. I really don't remember. But for J.R.R. Tolkien, because that was at the very beginning and it had no history, he felt the readers would not be interested in that at all. So he chose not to publish it. Obviously, Christopher Tolkien felt differently after his dad died and decided to publish it 3 or 4 years after J.R.R. Tolkien died. I think he published it in 76 and Tolkien died in 73, something like that.
I get why Tolkien would feel that way though, because I've read so many adventure stories where they talk about past battles or past warriors like heroes, and the current characters draw from their own history, and you're like,
Hmm.
well, that's so interesting, what happened back then. And then you start to think about what might have happened, and it is the mystery that makes it interesting. But I do like, you know that the Silmarillion is out there, because even though I haven't read the whole thing, it's still interesting to see how his world came to be.
I've never read the Silmarillion.
I've read
I
like
haven't read it.
maybe half of it. I've gotten through half of it. I've never finished it, but I've read like half of it.
Never, never. I don't even think I think I've tried to read it. I have several copies of it, but never got through the whole thing. I've only read a few pages here and there.
It does make you think of the Bible in some way because it's a creation story, so it starts at the beginning when there's nothing.
I don't want to get off topic too much, but one of the reasons why, and boy, I know people are gonna slam me to hell for saying this. One of the reasons why I don't like reading the Bible is because I feel like it's a fairy tale, and I have a hard time believing what I'm reading because while they say it's the word of Christ and the word of God, it's not God or Christ that actually wrote it.
No, it's
It's
a
other
group.
people, it's other men. And then,
Yeah.
to be honest with you, it's men. There was no women wrote anything in the Bible. It's all men.
Yeah, it was a group of men, like a congress almost, that got together and decided what they wanted to put in it.
So,
Yeah.
really? I mean, I want to believe, and look, I believe in God. I believe in Jesus Christ. I firmly do. I think that that is, I feel strongly that it's real. I really do. There's some type of almighty being. Some people call it God, some people call it other things. But I think there's an almighty being that kind of governs, just like science governs what we do. I think there's an almighty being that governs what we do, and it may be a blend of that being and science. I don't know. So I am a believer that God exists and that it's real because I feel it. I don't think you can have love and the good things that are in life without having it. But anyway, I don't want to get too far in that because this isn't about the Bible. But I just I have a hard time reading the Bible, and I've read the Bible. I've read many parts of the Bible, never read the whole thing. I have a hard time reading it because of that. And maybe that's why when I tried to read the Silmarillion, I didn't like reading the Silmarillion because I think it reminded me, like just like you said, it would have turned me off to read it because I just have a hard time believing that it's real. It didn't feel like a story. It almost felt like here's how everything began. You got to believe this is true. This is the only existence. This is it. I just have a hard time with that.
And there are a lot of people who have had a hard time reading the Silmarillion.
Yeah. So, that's just one piece of it that he mentions in the
Yeah, in the
forward was the
forward.
Silmarillion. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted
Um,
to talk about from the Silmarillion standpoint. He does everything. He does a lot of explaining. And now I'm actually getting out of the forward, so we can go back to it in a second. But I just wanted to make a comment that it seems like J.R.R. Tolkien did a lot of his explanations in the form of writing out songs, creating his own type of language, and writing poems to explain places and people. That's how he introduced a lot of characters and places, and that's how his concepts came up. He actually wrote poems that describe the lands and all that stuff. So
wasn't he a linguist? I don't know all about his academic history, so I
yeah,
don't know. I do know he taught at a woman's college at some point,
if I remember right, and I could be
because
wrong,
that's where
I
he
think he
wrote The
was
Hobbit.
he was a linguist. I think he was a linguist.
So maybe that's why there's so much like that's why he played around with
I know he was a
language.
professor, but a professor of what? John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. He was a English writer, poet, theologist, university professor. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon and a fellow of Pembroke College and Oxford. He was a Merton Professor of the English Language and Literature. There you
Yeah.
go.
Because you get that sense he must have liked languages very much because he messed around with language a lot.
Rainbow Kittles says, "Hey, Daddy." Hello. We got somebody in chat. How you doing? Thanks for joining us.
So
So obviously,
he
he was a
has,
professor of language,
and it
literature.
kind of
So
seems like he's got like 3 or 4 names for a lot of different, not just characters but places. He's got so many different names for different things.
yeah, this is really difficult to explain. I think we're crazy taking this on and trying to, but we're just trying to give our interpretation of it.
I first read Lord of the Rings in middle school, like the end of middle school.
I read them all in its entirety right after you were born. I read pieces of it in high school, but never the whole thing. I read after you were born. I read the entire thing. I think that's why you're as nuts about reading as you are, because I would read it while you sleeping on my chest in a recliner all night for months in a row. I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings all the way through.
And I first started reading it after the first movie came out.
Trying to see
So,
if there's anything else. It's a Professor Shipley that helped him organize a lot of those notes. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything else in the forward that we want to really cover it. This we can go ahead and you can kick off chapter one. I don't really see. I mean, it's just they just talk. He just talks about how there's different like you just mentioned multiple names for several different people and places. So yeah,
yeah, the forward, he explains a lot about what the tales are and how he, put it all together. Yeah. And how the mariner, like cuz Errol, the main character, that we meet in chapter 1 is a mariner, and he travels and he comes to the Lost Island or the island. Um, and he wants to settle down for the night, and then he comes to the cottage of lost play.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, chapter 1 is short because it's about Errol coming to the cottage and then being told stories about the history of that island and the history about the cottage itself. So we and the cottage is magical. He goes there and it's bigger on the inside. It didn't, either the way it's explained, it's like you shrink and you go in and the cottage is huge.
Yeah, it's a fairy story. It's a magical place. I mean, it's pretty obvious from the way it's written that it's a place of magic because you actually shrink down to a size to where you fit inside the cottage once you get there. And I don't think
And
it's just the
it's
cottage. I think it's that whole island or of Courtier, and it kind of made it seem like it was a place in the trees. Did I miss that, or did I dream that? Maybe I just dreamt that part. That stuff is so confusing.
Yeah, because, well, sometimes he calls it a city, sometimes he calls it a town or a village. And I'm like, was it a city or is it a town or a village? Because there's differences in the sizes of each of those things. If Corterion is a city, it would be, bigger, right? It would be big and bustling. Or maybe I'm
And
just
it
thinking
could
of
be
it too
depending on your
literally.
size. It could be depending on your size. It may
Yeah.
be small to the rest of the world, but it could be huge because you shrink once you get inside to fit.
In the cottage, yeah. And that's not even the original cottage because Errol, when he gets inside and he meets Lindo and Ver, the host and hostess that own the place, and it's full of children, and they there's like the gong warden where it's one ring for dinner and then three rings for story time. And when it and like the best part of the day is the three rings for story time.
Yeah. Maybe I'm dense, w- it- I, or I just didn't understand everything I read, and that's quite possible. What did you get out of it that made you, or that explained what the purpose of the cottage was? I was trying to understand that, and I ain't got no clue.
Well, that's not, well, the cottage itself is like a recreation or recreation of the cottage, a cottage that existed in Valinor, where children would go there in their dreams, and something happened and the fairies left or the elves left and the cottage was blocked. So Inui asked Lindo and Ver to create the cottage in Cortirion, and they recreated it, and they have all of these like lost children, including their own children, and it's just a cottage for stories. So the purpose of the cottage of lost play is like a cottage of where they tell stories that have been around for ages. And Errol, once he gets to the cottage, he loses that feeling of being lost, or a feeling of that restlessness that made him want to wander. And he gets there and he feels like he doesn't want to leave. He feels like he's where he's meant to be or something.
Yeah.
So, and they ask him, well, they ask, what stories are we going to tell tonight? And Errol asks them, tell me the story of the history of the cottage and the land. And that's what this first chapter is about. It's about Lindo and Ver talking about the history of the island itself, and about, oh, well, this is not the original cottage. The original cottage existed in Valinor.
Which is the first city of the elves, or where the elves came from. Give me 1 second, everybody. Hold on real quick. We'll be right back. Um, Hey, we're gonna take a short break. We may or may not be back. I seem to be still having some internet problems because Dana keeps locking up, and I think it's on my end. It's not on her end. I think I'm just having some internet problems. My internet provider had issues today, and our internet was up and down all afternoon. So I'm gonna reboot my modem, and we may be back. If not, we'll continue this. We'll actually probably start it over and just redo the whole show at another point. But we may be back in a few minutes. So just give me a short break, and we'll be back shortly. Hopefully. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, we'll be right back.